Daniel Whitmore stepped out of the taxi, taking a deep breath of the crisp countryside air he had been away from for so many years. He had imagined that after a long time working in Singapore, returning to his family's farm would bring a sense of warmth and familiarity. But as he looked into the distance, where lush green fields and the old wooden farmhouse should have been, an unbelievable sight unfolded before his eyes. A massive hotel with towering glass walls stretched high, obscuring the horizon. A vast parking lot, filled with hundreds of cars coming and going, and a brightly lit sign reading Riverside Grand Resort, a name completely foreign to him, yet now boldly standing on the very land his ancestors had preserved for generations. Daniel felt a tight knot in his chest. No one had warned him about this. There had been no phone call, no letter, no notification whatsoever that the Whitmore farm had been turned into a commercial property. Walking quickly toward the hotel entrance, Daniel scanned his surroundings, searching for something familiar, a lone tree, a fence post, or any trace of the past. But everything had been wiped away. Even the wooden house he had grown up in was gone, replaced by a stone-paved walkway leading to the grand entrance of the luxury lobby. His heart sank as he realized that his childhood memories now only existed in his mind. He stepped up to the reception desk, trying to keep his composure, though his voice couldn't completely hide the tension. "I'm Daniel Whitmore. I need to speak with the manager. I need to know why this hotel is standing on my family's land." The receptionist, a young woman with a well-rehearsed smile, glanced at him with hesitation. "I'm sorry, sir, but do you have a reservation? If not, I'm afraid I can't." "This is my land." Daniel cut her off, his voice rising with anger. A well-dressed man, presumably the manager, quickly approached with a polite but calculated smile. "Mr. Whitmore, I believe you need to take this up with the local council. This hotel was built legally under the approval of the Homeowners Association, HOA. Daniel froze. The Homeowners Association? He had never agreed to let anyone manage his land. He turned away, his mind racing with questions. One thing was certain, this fight was far from over. Daniel Whitmore sat in a small cafe near the town center, his gaze fixed on the steaming cup of black coffee in front of him. His return home had been far from what he had imagined. His family's farm was gone, replaced by a luxurious hotel. And now, he had uncovered an even bigger shock. The Homeowners Association, HOA, an organization he had never been part of, had decided the fate of his family's land. But who was behind this? One name kept surfacing in every conversation he overheard: Karen Reynolds. An hour later, Daniel had all the information he needed. Karen was the HOA president and the most influential figure in town. She was notorious for her aggressive decisions, often abusing her authority to bend the community to her will. For years, she had pushed to transform this small town into a commercial hub, ignoring the protests of longtime residents. Now, she had erased the legacy of the Whitmore farm to fulfill her vision. A slow, burning fury settled in Daniel's chest. He needed to understand how the HOA had legally seized control of his land. Conversations with old neighbors and research into property records revealed the answer. Karen had exploited a vague loophole in zoning regulations. According to this law, if a piece of land was deemed abandoned or neglected for a certain period, the HOA could assume control and repurpose it for community benefit. That was her trick. Karen had declared the Whitmore farm abandoned while Daniel was working in Singapore. But that was a lie. Before leaving, Daniel had hired a caretaker to maintain the property. He had even paid property taxes on time. So how had the HOA managed to strip him of his legal ownership? He flipped through document after document until he found something highly suspicious, a meeting transcript from the HOA, which stated that a formal notice had been sent to the property owner before the takeover. Daniel had never received any such notice. No letter, no email, no phone call. That could only mean one thing. The HOA had falsified the legal process, exploiting loopholes to claim his land for themselves. But Daniel was not someone who could be easily bullied. He knew that anger alone wouldn't win this battle. He needed hard evidence. He needed the law on his side. Leaning back in his chair, deep in thought, he came to a realization. Karen Reynolds might have thought she had won, but she had no idea she had just chosen the wrong opponent. Daniel Whitmore knew that if he wanted to reclaim his family's farm, he couldn't rely on emotions alone. He needed evidence. He had to prove that Karen Reynolds and the HOA had illegally seized his land, and that meant diving headfirst into a tough legal battle. The very next day, Daniel went to the town hall to dig through property records. After hours of combing through stacks of thick legal documents, he finally found it, his family's original land ownership certificate, signed by his father over 30 years ago. It confirmed that the Whitmore farm was private property, completely outside the jurisdiction of the HOA. That document alone should have been enough to prevent anyone from interfering with his land. Yet, somehow, the HOA had still found a way to circumvent the law and take it. Daniel continued his research and uncovered something even more disturbing, a secret HOA meeting held the previous year. In that meeting, Karen and the board declared the Whitmore farm abandoned. The meeting minutes stated that the HOA had sent a formal notice to the owner, but Daniel had never received any letter, email, or phone call. This could only mean one thing: the HOA had falsified the entire legal process. The deeper Daniel dug, the more corruption he found. Another document revealed that Riverside Development Group, the company that built the hotel, had donated a large sum of money to the HOA just before the project was approved. The payment had been disguised as a community management fee, but in reality, it was nothing more than a bribe. This was proof that Karen hadn't just illegally taken his land, she had profited from it. Knowing he needed a witness to strengthen his case, Daniel reached out to Margaret Lewis, a former HOA board member who had resigned after clashing with Karen. When Daniel asked her about the meeting concerning his farm, Margaret shook her head and said, "I never saw any official notice sent to the property owner. I objected when the HOA tried to take over the land, but Karen shut me down immediately. She said anyone who opposed her would be removed from the board. In the end, I resigned." Margaret's statement was a turning point. It confirmed that Karen had manipulated the HOA meetings and intentionally concealed key information to seize the Whitmore farm. Now, Daniel had everything he needed: a land ownership certificate proving that his farm was never under HOA jurisdiction, internal HOA documents exposing the falsified legal notices, evidence of bribery between the HOA and Riverside Development Group. Margaret Lewis's testimony confirming that Karen had deliberately violated legal procedures. Feeling the time was right to strike back, Daniel hired a lawyer and filed a lawsuit. He wasn't just fighting to reclaim his farm, he was determined to expose the HOA's corruption once and for all. When Karen received the lawsuit, she couldn't hide her fury. She had assumed Daniel would either accept defeat or settle for a compensation deal. But she was wrong. Daniel wasn't here to negotiate. He was here to take back what rightfully belonged to his family. Daniel Whitmore knew that a direct attack wasn't the best way to take down Karen Reynolds and the HOA. If he wanted to win, he needed to make them trap themselves, forcing them to expose their own wrongdoing in front of both the public and the law. So instead of confronting them head-on, he decided to play by their rules, or at least make them think he was. Daniel reached out to the HOA, requesting a meeting with Karen and the board to negotiate. As he expected, Karen agreed immediately. She believed he was trying to strike a deal, hoping to recover some compensation for the land he had lost. But in reality, Daniel had no intention of compromising. He was setting a trap. The meeting was held at the HOA office, where Karen and the board members sat around a large conference table, confident and composed. Daniel entered, carrying a thick folder of documents, but revealing nothing about the evidence he had gathered. "I want to better understand how the HOA was able to take control of my land," Daniel began, his tone calm but purposeful. "As far as I know, there's a legal process that must be followed. I just want to make sure everything was done correctly." Karen flashed a sharp smile. "Oh, of course, Daniel. We followed all the regulations. Perhaps you're unaware, but we sent a notice to the property owner before making any decisions." This was exactly what Daniel had been waiting for. He pulled out a copy of his family's land ownership certificate and placed it on the table. "That's strange," he said, "because according to government records, I'm still the legal owner of this land, and I never received any notice from the HOA." Karen blinked, but kept her composure. "There may have been a mailing issue, But that doesn't change the fact that the HOA has the right to take over abandoned land if the owner does not respond. Without a word, Daniel calmly opened his folder and took out the HOA's secret meeting transcript, which explicitly stated that no notice had ever been sent. He slid the document across the table. Then maybe you can explain why, in this internal HOA record, you personally stated that there was no need to send a notice because Whitmore was never coming back. The room went silent. Some of the HOA members exchanged uneasy glances, realizing that Karen had just been caught in a lie. But Daniel wasn't finished yet. He pulled out HOA financial records, pointing to a large payment from Riverside Development Group, the same company that had built the hotel on his land. And here's the so-called community management fee the HOA received right before deciding to hand over my land to Riverside Development Group. I'm sure the courts will find this particularly interesting. This time, Karen turned pale. She tried to find a way to justify it, but before she could speak, one of the HOA board members, who had already been growing suspicious, stood up and said, "Karen, did you lie to us?" Everything was unraveling exactly as Daniel had planned. Karen was losing control. Some board members began voicing their concerns, realizing they could be dragged into a lawsuit if they continued to support her. Daniel delivered the final blow. "I'm not here to negotiate," he said, his voice calm yet firm. "I just wanted you all to know that I have all the evidence I need, and I will be taking this to court." Karen had nothing left to say. She had backed herself into a corner, her own words and actions exposing her corruption. As Daniel walked out of the meeting, he left behind an HOA in chaos. The trap had worked. Now, there was only one thing left to do: let the law finish what he had started. A few weeks after the pivotal HOA meeting, Daniel Whitmore's lawsuit was officially accepted by the court. Karen Reynolds and her associates had no escape. The evidence was undeniable. The HOA had exploited legal loopholes to seize land, falsified the notification process, and accepted bribes from Riverside Development Group to push forward an illegal hotel project. As news of the scandal spread, public outrage erupted across the community. From the very first hearing, Daniel and his legal team laid out the full truth. His family's legal land ownership certificate, internal HOA meeting records, and Margaret Lewis's testimony all became irrefutable proof. Under mounting pressure, several HOA board members turned against Karen, admitting that they had been forced to follow her directives. Karen, once arrogant and confident, now stood as nothing more than a desperate woman grasping for a way out. But there was no escape from the final verdict. The HOA had no legal authority to take over the Whitmore farm, and the entire transaction with Riverside Development Group was declared null and void. The hotel was ordered to be shut down and completely demolished. Karen Reynolds was removed from her position and faced fraud charges. The HOA was required to pay damages to Daniel and his family. Riverside Development Group was placed under investigation for corruption. The day the hotel was torn down, hundreds of residents gathered, watching one of the town's most corrupt projects crumble to the ground. Daniel stood among them, observing as glass panels shattered and walls collapsed, a victory not just for him, but for everyone who had ever been abused by the HOA's overreach. Karen Reynolds left town in disgrace. Her name would forever be tied to the downfall of the HOA, serving as a lasting lesson in greed and the abuse of power. As for Daniel, he had done more than reclaim his land. He had protected his family's legacy, proving that justice still exists and that no one can take what is rightfully his without facing the consequences. As the last remnants of the hotel were torn down, the Whitmore farm was finally restored to its rightful owner. Daniel Whitmore stood on the land his ancestors had preserved for generations, feeling the wind sweep across the open fields. This had not just been a legal battle. It was a fight for honor, for justice, and for the right to ownership that no one had the authority to violate. This event became a wake-up call for the entire town. Residents began re-evaluating how the HOA had operated for years and the injustices they had silently endured. Many stepped forward to expose other abuses of power, forcing local authorities to intervene and tighten regulations on homeowners associations. The days of unchecked HOA control were over. For Daniel, his fight did not stop at personal victory. He chose to use his experience to advocate for legal reform, ensuring that no one else would have to go through what he did. He worked with lawyers and activists to establish new protections for private landowners against HOA fraud and overreach. As for Karen Reynolds, she was left with nothing. Her name became a symbol of greed and downfall. Those who once supported her turned their backs, and she left town in disgrace, carrying a permanent stain of shame. Gazing out at the green fields slowly coming back to life, Daniel realized that this had never been just about a farm or a piece of land. It was about justice, about truth, and about the right to stand up and defend what is yours. And if there was one lesson to take away from it all, it was this: never let the greedy take what belongs to you without a fight. Daniel Whitmore's story is more than just a legal battle to reclaim his ancestral land. It is a powerful reminder that no one has the right to take what belongs to you unless you allow it. In life, especially as we grow older, there will always be forces looking to exploit loopholes, manipulate rules, and take advantage of the vulnerable. But silence and submission only empower the wrongdoers, while standing firm and fighting for your rights is the only way to preserve what truly matters. People like Karen Reynolds exist everywhere, whether they are corrupt HOA officials, greedy corporations, or individuals who exploit trust for personal gain. But what brings them down is not just the law. It is when people like Daniel have the courage to stand up, to fight back, and to refuse to be silenced in the face of injustice. This story delivers an important message. We are never too old to stand up for what is right. No matter the circumstances, always remember that justice exists, but only for those who are willing to demand it. Like Daniel, if you believe in the truth, prepare yourself, and persist in your fight for what is right, you will reclaim what is yours, even if it means facing forces that seem too powerful to defeat.